really, All Saints people and all the people in the All Saints orbit have a responsibility both to know about it and take some action on. And around here, we try to get informed about the action that we're contemplating. So I'm really, really happy to have somebody whom I'll introduce in just a second to be our teacher today and to help us understand all of the complexities, or many of the complexities, of our climate crisis. I do want to welcome those of you who are visiting with us. Thank you very much for being with us. We love having you here. We would love for you to fill out a visitor's card. It's right outside the front door here so that we can continue to invite you into these environments and situations and presentations. Also, at All Saints, we put our faith into action, and today we're focusing on modified foods, and we would like to make sure that we have labeling for genetically engineered foods. You can get information about that at this table, and then there's a letter we invite you to sign to send to your congressperson. We're going to continue to have a series of presentations here in the Rector's Forum about climate crisis, and we want to make sure that we have people engaged who want to be engaged in helping us think through the best responses that we can make as a community. So I'm going to ask Francisco Garcia to come and talk a little bit about that. Francisco is our Director of Peace and Justice. He's the man who will be organizing us to move forward. So I love for people to applaud, people who come to the microphone. Applaud Francisco Garcia.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So at All Saints, we've been building various teams and communities of people that are looking at issues that matter so much to us, like economic justice, mass incarceration, and the issue of climate justice and our response to environmental problems is another one of those areas that we want to build a strong group of people from various aspects of this community that just really care deeply about this and are going to be motivated to take us onto our next course. What are we really going to do around these issues in a sustained effort? And we have a number of wonderful ministries that have been dedicated to this work that some of you are involved with, Eden and Sustainable World, and we want to help them. We want to grow that group. We want to grow everyone's capacity to do that work. So we have a sign-up sheet at the table. And so if you're interested in working on climate justice issues, give us your information, your name, email, phone, so that we can be in touch with you in the near future. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Francisco. Our speaker this morning is often called the prophet of California climate. Bill Patzert is a scientist at the California Institute of Technology's NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, in Pasadena here. His research is focused on the application of NASA satellite data to improve our understanding of our planet's climate and important environmental problems, ranging from developing El Nino, La Nina, and long-term climate forecasts, to monitoring the health of coral reefs. The author of many scientific and popular articles, Bill works with undergraduate and graduate students from all over the world and lectures at many local universities. He is often sought out by reporters and is regularly seen on local and national television representing NASA and JPL. And in a recent article, he was named as one of the West's most influential individuals in dealing with water issues. A graduate of Purdue University, he earned his PhD in oceanography at the University of Hawaii. Bill began his career on the research faculty of the University of California's Scripps Institution of Oceanography at La Jolla, and then moved to JPL, where he's been employed since 1983. During his career, he served as a consultant to many respected organizations, not only NASA, but the U.S. Department of Commerce, United Nations, and many scientific and environmental groups. He's received many awards for scientific accomplishments, as well as communicating science to the public. including 4 NASA Exceptional Service Medals and the highest award of the French Space Agency. So, we are happy to have Bill with us today. We went through a few days the other day where we were hotter than blazes, and while at the same time there were beyond belief blizzards on the East Coast. What's going on? Well, we have a renowned scientist, an expert communicator and teacher to help us understand that. Will you please warmly welcome Bill Patzert?
Well, thanks for the inflated introduction. And thank you, everybody, for showing up. It's always nice when people show up. Now, it's been many decades since I've been in a church, so I hope we don't get hit by lightning here today. But I understand this is a different kind of church. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the drought, all right? We've had a drought that's lasted for almost 2 decades here in California. Some people think it just arrived yesterday, and some people think it's the apocalypse. Well, you can relax. It's not the apocalypse, but it is big, all right? So, interesting things about the drought are, why are we having a drought? When did this drought start? And when's it going to be over? Now, in the process of doing this research on the drought, I came across some really interesting results, and I hope I don't try to make this talk too complex, but I want to share it with you. And it turns out that this drought is very much tied up with the rate of global warming that we see on the planet, all right? So stick with me here, because we're going to start with drought and we're going to end with global warming. So there is a drought, global warming. You know, for the past 20 years, there's been what we call a hiatus or a pause in global warming. It's sort of leveled out. And so global warming skeptics have picked up on this as if global warming is all over. But the punchline is it's definitely not all over. Now, the interesting thing about drought, like everything else in life, is not fair, all right? It's uneven, all right? In fact, here in Pasadena, or in the greater Southern California area, most of you haven't even felt the drought. There's no forced rationing, all right? Where I live, which is Sierra Madre, come on, let's get right down to it. Sierra Madre, Altadena, Pasadena, it looks like a rainforest, all right? There's so many green lawns, all right, that there is no drought. But for many people, ranchers, farmers that are fallowing their fields, ranchers that are losing their herd, there is a serious drought. All right, so here you are, all right? All right? The question is, you know, for you it's a curiosity, all right? But I know some of you are doing the right thing. I know you're putting in drought-tolerant yards and taking those short showers. Right? Right. Okay. All right, let's talk about, when we talk about drought, let's talk about what rainfall is in Southern California. This is Sierra Madre where I live. Average rainfall is about 24 inches a year. Downtown, it's about 15 inches a year. At the coast, it's about 10 or 12 inches a year, all right? And you can see here we are in May, and really from May to September or October, we don't get any rain. So I can guarantee you there's not going to be hardly any rain for the next 6 months. How's that for the profit, all right? So we get our rain in the winter, and then we follow by 6 months of very dry weather, all right? Now, I know this stuff is right because I actually measured it, all right? Now, let's look back to 2000 up to the present. This is the rainfall in inches in Sierra Madre. Now, you can see the red years. We've had a lot of below normal years in Sierra Madre, all right? We had a couple of big years. Remember 2004, 2005? That was a big year. But essentially, 10 out of the last 15 years have been dry. So this drought started building in 1999 or 2000. And these big droughts, they don't happen in 1 year. They creep up on you very, very slowly, all right? You get deeper and deeper every year, all right? So this year, our average rainfall downtown is 15 inches. Right now, we're at about 6 inches of rain, and we're pretty much finished. That's 42% of normal, all right? And last calendar year, that's January to December, we only had 3.6 inches. Now, in the historical record, which is about 135, 136 years, that was the driest year in the historical record, going back to the 1870s. That was dry. Most of the West has been in a very dry 3 years. Over the last 3 years, we've been below 50% of normal in California. So I'm going to tell you that this drought started in 1999, and by the time I'm finished, you'll actually believe me, all right? Now, this is the most complicated thing I'm going to show. This is 1878 up to the present. This is inches of rainfall in Los Angeles. Okay, not too complicated? Okay. Now, this is the rainfall every year. You can see we get very few years where we get these big, heavy rains, more than 20 inches a year. Those are generally El Niños. This purple line is the trend. For all practical purposes, there's no trend, all right? But there's tremendous variability from, year to year, all right? So we have a rainfall roller coaster here. And then we also have, look, from the 1940s, about the 1970s, this is the smooth curve, the 10-year smooth curve. You can see sometimes we get 2 or 3 decades where it's way below normal, all right? So we get dry, not only years, we get dry decades. The 1980s and the 1990s, you can see there were a lot of El Niños and unusually heavy rainfall. It turns out that the 1980s and the 1990s, when a lot of the infrastructure and the civilization was developed here in Southern California, were like the wettest 2 decades in about 200 years. So we got used to that. Whereas recently here, you can see how rainfall has really dropped off. That's our drought, all right? The other thing is, when you look at this curve, these curves, this rainfall maps, 6 out of 10 years are below normal, all right? So I got to be careful when you use the word normal, right? I always say normal is a cycle on a washing machine. It doesn't have anything to do with rainfall. So 6 out of 10 years is below normal. So if somebody asks you, what's the rainfall going to be next year, what are you going to say? It's going to be a little below normal, all right? Now, if you had those kind of odds when you went to Vegas, all right, you'd be able to buy this church, all right? 6 out of 10 years is pretty good odds, below normal. So what do we know? There's no trend. The wettest year was a few years ago, 2004, over 38 inches. Driest year was 3 inches. That was 2 years after the wettest year, all right? So that's a lot of variability. And 11 of the last 16 years have been below normal. Our weather, our rainfall, is controlled a lot by what I call fire hose events. These are atmospheric river events, all right? A good example is like, remember at the end of February, at the beginning of March, we had 3 or 4 days of heavy rainfall. So that was interesting because it actually accounted for those 3 days, 75% of our annual total, all right? Then we get year to year, El Niños are wet, La Niñas are dry. And then we get, as I pointed out, these decadal or multi-year changes, all right? Now, why the drought? The drought is because of the PDO. Does anybody know what the PDO is? What's the PDO? Yeah? What's the PDO? Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to tell you what the PDO is. The PDO is, all right, an acronym for the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. Now, only a scientist could think of something like that. That's definitely a mouthful, all right? It's a pattern of sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean. So this is the Pacific Ocean. Here's North America. This is Asia over here. And this is a pattern of warmer is red, cooler is blue. So you get this big pattern here from the Aleutians to Antarctica, from the Americas to Asia, where you have a very warm wedge of water, unusually warm, surrounded by what I call a blue horseshoe of cooler water. Now sometimes that'll switch to the reverse of that pattern. Instead of a warm wedge here, you'll get a cool wedge surrounded by a warm horseshoe. So it's the same pattern, it's just flipped, all right? Now the interesting thing about this is that when you get this warm pattern, most of the ocean is in the tropics, and the Pacific covers 30% of the planet. When you get this warm pattern here, all right, it actually warms the entire Pacific. It actually warms the Pacific enough that it actually warms the Earth, all right? So you got a big pattern here that's warming the Pacific, and because the Pacific is so big, it's actually warming the Earth, all right? So think of it as a big, long-lasting El Nino, all right? Whereas when it flips to this cool wedge, it does just the opposite. It cools the Pacific and actually cools the entire Earth. So this is a big pattern. It's important. Okay, now how does this change? All right, this is from 1900 to 2000. And this tells you whether the pattern is warm or cool. So notice from the mid-1940s to the early 1970s, it's blue. It's like that. The 1980s and the 1990s are warm. It's red, okay? So it's like this. 1980s and 1990s, it was a warm PDO. Presently, we switched over the last 2 decades to a cool PDO, okay? That thing's complicated. Stick with me, all right? I'm going to take you there. I'm going to take you to the promised land, all right? All right, let's look at the rainfall again. Remember the mid-1940s to the early 70s? It tended to be less rainfall, right? The 80s and the 90s, lots of El Niños with heavy rainfall, all right? Let's go back again. So when we had less rainfall, we had this pattern. When we had heavy rainfall, we had this pattern. All right, and let's just look at this period from the early 1940s to the present. All right? And let's look at the PDO again. You see when it's in this warm phase, you get a lot of rain. When it's in this cool phase, you get less rain. Interesting, huh? So let's lay those two on top of each other. This is what it looks like. All right? So here's the rainfall, this blue heavy line, and here's the PDO. So during the wet years, you're in a warm PDO. And during the cool years, the dry years, you're in a cool PDO. All right? Now, I hope that's not too complicated, all right? So these large shifts in the Pacific Ocean, in the temperature pattern in the Pacific, seem to have a profound impact on rainfall in California. All right? So it's wet during the positive PDO and dry during the negative PDO. Now, how dry is dry? This is what's called the U.S. Drought Monitor. It comes out every week. This is the latest one. I look at it every week. All right. And really, for the last 15 years, it hasn't looked dramatically different than this. Everything that's red and yellow and brown here means that we're in drought. Serious drought. All right. Notice that just about everything west of the Mississippi is in drought. And it's been that way for the last 12 to 15 years. The drought in Texas and Oklahoma is unbelievably serious. Since I've been looking at this monitor, I've never seen the entire state of California in what I call a severe to serious drought. All right. So it's big, this drought. It's not just local, it's not just Pasadena, all right? 100% of California is in severe or larger drought, all right? Okay. Now, of course, this is the great flag of the state of California, right? And I like this little cartoon because one of the things about the drought in all the local neighborhoods, you notice anybody that lives up near the foothills, you notice all the critters that are coming out of the national forest? Yeah, the coyotes, the bears. We're chasing bears in Sierra Madre. That was kind of fun. Poor little Barry was scared to death, all right? But you get a lot of raccoons, possums, bobcats, because it's dry. They're thirsty and they're hungry up there, all right? Now, when we get this drought pattern, or this negative PDO, or a La Nina, all right, this is what the jet stream pattern over North America tends to be. A blocking high pressure system in the north. You know, you hear on the evening news, Dallas Rains or one of the weather forecasters would be showing you this. This is the pattern. For instance, this winter, this started in October, and actually we're not out of it yet. All right? As the pastor mentioned, is that we're still dry in California, and they're still feeling winter in the upper Midwest and the Northeast. So this pattern really locked in October, and you know, spring really hasn't arrived yet. All right? So when you get this pattern, the southern tier of the United States is very dry, and you get what they call the polar vortex of the Arctic Express, pounding out of northern Canada and the Arctic, like this. And so how many times have we seen this on the evening news? All right? This pattern really locked in this winter, and in many ways, it's locked in for the past decade. And so they've had very fierce winter in the upper Midwest, Northeast, and even down in the Southeast. And they're still having it. Denver had a big hailstorm yesterday, all right? Like they would have in the middle of winter, all right? And of course, we're bone dry. And so this big pattern of temperature in the Pacific has a strong impact on the jet stream patterns over North America. Not only North America, over Europe, as well as over Asia. They had a particularly fierce winter, for instance, in Western China and Japan this winter, as well as parts of Europe. So some places are warmer, some places are cooler, all right? And on the average, it all evens out, except the extremes are greater, all right? So this PDO can have a large impact. It has a global impact, and it has a long-lasting impact, all right? And this is my favorite one. If you don't believe in the PDO, take a look at Lake Mead. Now, Lake Mead, you know, that's the one behind Hoover Dam. Everybody's been there, right? Everybody been to Hoover Dam? All right. If you haven't, go before you die. It's a great place, you know, really interesting. All right. Notice there's a ring around Lake Mead. That ring is about 120 feet, all right, high, which is about half the volume of Lake Mead. So that means half the water is out of Lake Mead, all right? It's half of what it could be, all right? Now, why is that, all right? Why is that? Now, it turns out at the peak in the 80s and the 90s of the positive PDO, when we were really wet, all right, this was the top of the ring. Actually, in 1983, there was so much rain on the Colorado watershed and in LA. Everybody remember the El Nino of '82? That was really stormy. But it actually, Lake Mead almost overflowed Hoover Dam. They had to start releasing water like crazy. Otherwise, the water was going to come over the dam. But slowly, during the 80s and the 90s, as we got into the new century here, in the negative PDO, when things were much, much drier in the West, all right, all of a sudden it's been dropping. Now that can't happen in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years because the fill time for Lake Mead is 17 years. All right, so the only way that this can happen is if you get a shift that has a 20-year period that lasts for a couple of decades. So the next time you go to Lake Mead, all right, and you see that ring around it, you're going to say, I know what that is. That's the PDO. There you go, all right? Now, the interesting thing about this, see this good-looking guy right here? Yeah? All right. And now he said, about 15, 16 years ago, he said that when you get a shift in the Pacific, water shift spells drought. JPL Ocean says Pacific holds the key, all right? So I was talking about a drought. What year was that? Anybody remember? All right. That was 2002, all right? So now one of the things I really hate in my life, and this goes back to my mother, remember your mother always used to tell you, I told you so, right? Well, I just want to say one thing. I told you so, all right? Because when we saw this shift in the Pacific, I was thinking drought, all right? And so it's kind of interesting. That's why science is so much fun, all right? So the PDO is definitely coupled to the drought. Now, talk about droughts. Colleagues of mine study tree rings, and they look back 1,500 years, 2,000 years in the American West. And it turns out that drought is a big part of the history of the West. Not only in the 20th century and the 19th century, I can tell you many stories of how drought wrote the history of California in the West. But during this period from about 800 up till through the medieval warming, they tell us this is percent of normal rainfall, all right, or the amount of droughts. So these red areas here, like in the 11th century, 12th century, we had mega droughts in the American West. We had droughts that lasted not for 20 years or 30 years. All right. The tree ring people tell us we had droughts that lasted for 100 years. Mega droughts, all right? And a good example here is when the Anastasi in the 1100s, when they dispersed from their great civilization there at Mesa Verde, they had a 100-year drought. Population had increased way beyond the capacity to sustain it, and so the civilization dispersed. This happened all over Mesoamerica. In Central America, we saw many civilizations. And so one of the great things we learn from history is that most great civilizations, the determining factor for any civilization is water, all right, and population, all right? And so the history of the West, not only the West, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, is a history written in droughts. Okay, now I'm going to switch a little bit. Anybody recognize this curve? That's the global warming curve, all right? That's what everybody's arguing about, is that the world is getting warmer. So this is the average temperature of the atmosphere, the land, and the oceans combined. This is the average temperature of the Earth. It used to be 56.5, now it's about 58. Average temperature of the Earth is increased by about 1.5, 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit. But look at the curve, all right? Everybody talks about global warming. Notice that in the first 30 years it was actually cooling. And then from 1910 to about 1940, it increased. And then notice from the mid-1940s to the early 1970s, it was flat, what we call a hiatus. Now, what happened from the mid-1940s to the early 1970s? Remember, we had a negative phase of the PDO, all right? And then notice during the 1980s and the 1990s, there was almost a 1-degree increase in global temperature. So of the 1.6 degrees, 1 degree of it actually happened in 20 years, the 1980s and the 1990s. And recently, of course, it's been flat. So there's the average curve. But the average is one thing, but the devil is really in the details here, okay? It actually has that's the average per year. It's only 12 thousandths of a degree Fahrenheit per year, all right? Now, I gave a talk at Caltech last month on Earth Day. I was actually there. Anybody there at first Earth Day? Yeah, 1970, there you go. Now, the interesting thing about Earth Day is that that's when I started my career, is that on Earth Day, was anybody talking about global warming? No. You know, actually know what they were talking about? Was a little ice age. See? Because it actually, from the mid-1940s to Earth Day, the temperature of the Earth was actually cooling. Interesting, huh? So that's the danger of looking at a short record. So when I started my career, there was no global warming. All right? There was a little ice age coming. All right? Now, let's look at this. The negative PDO when we had droughts in California and the American West, positive PDO in the 80s and the 90s, and the negative PDO recently, all right? So that's pretty interesting, all right? So during a negative PDO, global warming went flat. During a positive PDO, it increased dramatically in 20 years, and recently it's gone flat again. And so this is the one that the global warming skeptics pick up on, is that global warming has gone flat in the last decade, all right? All right, so let's review a little bit. Why the drought? The PDO steers the jet stream, all right? It modulates precipitation, regional water. It's big. It covers the entire West. It also impacts global temperatures and lots of other stuff. Marine ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems. There are many, many examples, all right? So when does the drought end? Anybody know when the drought ends? I think somebody said it. I couldn't hear it. Right. When the PDO shifts, right? So that's the key, you know. Now, if I was really knew my stuff, I could tell you when, all right? But I'm going to give you a hint, all right? You might be in for a surprise. Now, the American West is definitely written, history is written in droughts, right? All right. What happened to my, oh, something fell out here, all right? My point here on this one is that there were two pictures, one of Los Angeles in 1902 and one of Los Angeles today, all right? And the point I wanted to make was that in the last 60 years, the population of California has quadrupled. It's quadrupled, all right? So in 1950, the population of California was less than 10 million people. Now it's pushing 40 million people, all right? And that population increase, all by itself, creates its own drought, all right? And so part of the reason we're having droughts, or we're tight with water, is purely us, all right? There's more of us using more water, all right? Oh, there it is, all right? This is the part where I say, this is a picture I took in 1902 from Mount Wilson. Ed and I were up there. Yeah. All right, and this is a picture I took today. So the growth has been phenomenal, all right? The population of the United States has only doubled in that period. And so there's been a tremendous shift in population from the Midwest and the Northeast into the West and the Southwest, all right? And that's created its own drought in a place that is normally dry, all right? All right, so if we look at managing water in California, we have a naturally dry climate. When you get on an airplane and you fly from LA to Washington or New York, and you look down, what color is it? It's brown, right? It's always brown, all right? As soon as you hit the Mississippi, what color is it? It's green, right? So it's naturally dry here, all right? Now, of course, global warming is going to impact all this. I'll talk about that in a minute. So, you know, the environment is very stressed out. There are tremendous agricultural demands on water. 60%, 70% of all the water in the state of California is used by agriculture. All right. Now, how much is agriculture a part of the economy of the state of California? 3%. Okay. So I told you earlier, water is not fair, right? So if agriculture is only 3% of the state's economy, why do they get 70% of the water? Okay? We've got a growing urban population. The economy is always changing in California. You know, the economy of California is the 6th largest economy in the world. It's bigger than the economy of Russia, and it's dynamic, all right? And there's been a tremendous technology explosion that has taken part in this state. And by the way, the technology people are big water users. And then we got a new person on the block. It turns out that some of the biggest shale oil reserves in the world are in California. They're actually sitting under Pasadena, all right, under the LA. So you actually are sitting on oil right here, all right? But oil fracking takes water. And so that's a whole new issue that people are going to have to deal with, all right? So my point is get used to drought. We're almost always in a quasi-drought, right? Yeah? This is one of my favorite, great American philosopher, right? Yogi Berra, all right? Like Yogi said, the future ain't what it used to be, all right? So this is where I'm supposed to say something pithy, you know, far-reaching. But, you know, the water management policy in this state is for more wet years than dry years. But the reality is just the opposite. 6 out of 10 years are dry. We have dry decades, all right? And even when you get wet years, and when nature behaves, as we look into the future, there's still going to be too many water demands to satisfy everybody. So decisions are going to have to be made about water. Now, if you ignore this reality, of course, there'll be dire consequences. And what's your worst nightmare in terms of who will handle your decisions about your water? What's your worst nightmare? Right. Politicians and lawyers, all right? So what's the most important thing about water and just about everything else that we do here in California? It's how you vote, all right? So make sure that you have enlightened people that you vote for, not only on all policies, but also on water policies, all right? Because water is a big deal here. It's a multi-billion-dollar business, all right? And the special interests definitely have it locked up. You don't, all right? Now, I'm going to give you a little hope, you know? This is, you know, usually I stop right here and my mom says, wow, you sound like the Grim Reaper, yeah? But here's a little hope. I don't know how many of you have been watching the news, but at JPL, we monitor the Pacific with a great series of satellites. And what we're seeing looks very similar in April of 2014 to April of 1997. See this red swath across the Pacific? This could be the beginning of an El Nino, all right? And of course, I love El Ninos, you know? I always say, hug your El Nino, because I love all that water, all right? And now this is the interesting thing about El Nino, if he's back. And of course, El Nino, or even better, a super El Nino, like we saw in 97. And I always call El Nino the great wet hope, you know? Charging over the horizon to save us all, right? All right? But let's go back to the global warming curve, all right? Now it's interesting. So what's the connection between the drought, between the El Nino, and the PDO? This is brand new research, all right? So this is very, very cool. Notice, remember, negative PDO, it's dry, you get a hiatus in global warming. Positive PDO, you get rapid global warming. Negative PDO, all right? All right, now, this is kind of interesting. When you get a big El Nino, you know, I asked you, when's the drought going to be over? And the answer is when the PDO flips, right? It turns out that these PDOs tend to flip with big El Ninos, which is kind of cool, all right? For instance, the 1941 El Nino, which was the big El Nino, by the way, had a big impact on World War II, flipped us into a dry 3 decades. The 1972 El Nino, some of you will remember, that was a very cool El Nino. That was my first year in California. And being a surfer, that's probably one of the best surfing years I've ever had, the winter of 72, all right? But that flipped us into a wet couple of decades, all right? and a warm couple of decades. And then the 1997 El Nino flipped us back to a dry decade. Okay, so if we have the 2014 El Nino, exactly what would it do? Okay, so this is where I find out who actually listened to me, all right? So potentially, if this El Nino is a flipper, what could we look forward to in the future with regards to water and global warming? Say it loud.
Global warming and more water.
Right, right? So California gets wetter, but global warming goes faster, all right? So there's good news and there's bad news, all right? But the interesting thing is how these large-scale patterns in the Pacific have such a big impact, globally and locally, all right? So my final message to you here is, when the Pacific speaks, you better listen, all right? Thanks a lot.
So we have 5 minutes for some questions. Here's a hand right here, please. Let's get started. And is there a second hand? Here's a second hand down here. Jim, if you'll come down to Michael. Okay, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting and very enlightening to see such a long swath of time. Recent news is about the shelf in Antarctica breaking off. And first of all, can you give me an idea of how big that is? If you were to overlay that on the United States, what would it look like? And second of all, how long would it take that to melt? And if it does all melt, how high is that going to go?
Well, you know, the great sources of fresh water in the world are tied up in the great ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland, all right? And as the world has warmed over the last 130 years, we're seeing more melting, not only in the ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland, also terrestrial glaciers. And so the net result is what happens to sea level when you add water to the oceans from melting ice. Of course, they're rising, all right? And the rise of sea level due to warming and melting, so you're living in a warming world and a melting world, has been about an 8-inch increase in sea level in the last 130 years. So beaches in California are definitely disappearing. Now, as the ocean warms, it's nibbling away at the bottom of those great ice sheets in Antarctica. And so rather than being hung up on the bottom, they're starting to accelerate and move out of the continent and break up and move into the ocean. Now, the net result of that could be anywhere from another 2 feet to another 6 feet of sea level rise. And the time scale is anywhere from 100 to 200 years, all right? So it's not immediately, all right? But in the long run, all right? So for instance, if all the ice in Greenland melted, sea level would rise approximately 36 feet, all right? But it's going to take a long time, all right? But that's the direction we're headed, all right? And there's no way to stop it. The question is how much you could slow it down by weaning off greenhouse, you know, our fossil fuel addiction, and slowing down the amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere. All right.
Here's a microphone.
I always thought our water supply in Southern California depended on the Colorado River. And what's happening to that?
Well, right now, as you can see in Lake Mead, the Colorado River is way down from where it was, Lake Mead. But in Southern California, there's 20 million of us, and 70% of our water is imported. Some from the Colorado, some from the Bay Delta, that's that great aqueduct that goes down the 5, and of course some from the Owens Valley, all right? And then we have local supplies of water where we store water, which is what we're on right now, that we're on reserves. But the Colorado River allocation is still being sent, you know, it's pumped over the Tehachapi's into Diamond Valley Lake near Hemet. Well, that's a ridiculous place, Las Vegas, all right? Yeah. But by the way, the level on Lake Mead is so low at this point is that the intake pipe for Las Vegas might be above water in the next couple of years, all right? That's how severe it is for Las Vegas, yeah? But 70% of our water is imported here, all right? 70%. San Diego, which has 3.5 million county, 3.5 million people, imports 95% of their water. 95% is imported in San Diego County. So I want to know who handed out all those building permits when there wasn't any water, all right? So that shows you, there's only one thing that's more important than water in California. What's that? Real estate.
Bill, thank you very much.